For 72 hours, the world has been nothing but explosions. The horizon is a wall of fire from their ships. The very island trembles. Soon it will stop. The silence will be worse than the noise. That is when they will come. We are told to fight for 10 of them for every one of us. But as the bombardment lifts, and we peer through the smoke at the landing craft on the horizon, a cold certainty settles in. We are not here to win. We are here to discover how much it will cost them to take this sand. This grim calculus, repeated on island after island, was not born in a vacuum. It was the brutal answer to a question first asked in the fetid jungles of Guadalcanal, a question that shattered an empire's most cherished illusions. Before the first shots were fired in the Pacific, Japanese military doctrine was built upon a foundation of perceived spiritual and martial superiority. The American soldier, they believed, was a product of comfort and capitalism. He was an individualist, lacking the self-sacrificial spirit of Bushido, the ancient warrior code that animated the Imperial Japanese Army. Propaganda posters depicted Americans as weak, clumsy, and concerned only with material wealth. Military planners in Tokyo were convinced that in the crucible of close-quarters combat, the American will to fight would simply evaporate. Their entire strategy depended on it. Inflict a series of swift, shocking defeats, and the soft Western power would sue for peace, leaving Japan to dominate its new Pacific Empire. On August 7th, 1942, this theory was put to the test. The United States 1st Marine Division landed on the shores of Guadalcanal. For the Japanese High Command, this was an opportunity, a chance to prove their doctrine correct. They dispatched a seasoned veteran, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, with an elite detachment of soldiers. Ichiki's men were the best of the best, veterans of the war in China. Their orders were simple: locate the American beachhead and annihilate it. Colonel Ichiki was so confident that he saw no need for a cautious reconnaissance. He would attack directly at night with bayonets fixed. He expected the Americans to scatter in terror. What he found instead, along a sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River, which the Marines called Alligator Creek, was a disciplined, prepared, and utterly lethal defensive line. The Banzai charge, an attack that had broken Chinese and Russian units, was met not with panic but with interlocking fields of machine gun fire, mortars, and canister shot from 37mm anti-tank guns. The Marines did not break. They held their ground, they followed orders, and they methodically dismantled the assault. By dawn, the creek was a scene of unimaginable slaughter. Of the nearly 1,000 men in Ichiki's first wave, almost 800 lay dead. Colonel Ichiki himself, disgraced and defeated, burned his regimental colors and took his own life. The shockwave from this single engagement reverberated all the way back to Tokyo. It was the first terrifying piece of evidence that their entire understanding of the enemy was catastrophically wrong. The reports that trickled back spoke of an opponent who was not only equipped with overwhelming firepower, but possessed a stubborn, unyielding ferocity in combat. They didn't just fight. They fought with a cold, professional rage. This wasn't a mob of merchants. This was an army of killers who held their ground, supported their comrades, and showed no hesitation in the face of a fanatical charge. Guadalcanal became the place where the myth died. It was here that the Japanese soldier first stared into the eyes of the American Marine and saw not the weakness his commanders had promised, but a terrifying reflection of his own warrior ethos, backed by an industrial power he could not possibly comprehend. The psychological foundation of Japan's war effort had been cracked, and it was only the beginning. The failure of Colonel Ichiki's charge was more than a tactical defeat. It was a philosophical crisis. The Imperial Japanese Army's strategy was predicated on breaking an enemy's spirit, on demonstrating a martial superiority so absolute that the will to resist would crumble. But on Guadalcanal, they discovered their enemy's spirit was not so brittle. The Marines didn't just fight. They were a relentless, grinding machine of attrition that operated 24 hours a day. This became the second defining characteristic that Japanese soldiers came to fear: the complete absence of reprieve. In other theaters of war, combat often followed a rhythm, a fierce attack, followed by a period of consolidation, resupply, and rest. Lulls in the fighting were expected. Essential moments to tend to the wounded, repair defenses, and reorganize for the next engagement. The Marines, however, fought a different kind of war. They waged a campaign of perpetual pressure. When the major assaults ceased, the harassment began. Aggressive patrols, sometimes platoon-sized, would push deep into the jungle, not just to gather intelligence, but to sow chaos and fear, to ensure that no Japanese soldier ever felt safe, even miles behind the front lines. Sleep was a luxury the Marines seemed determined to deny their opponents. Artillery and naval guns would fire not in massive, predictable barrages, but in sporadic, unnerving patterns throughout the night. A single shell landing in a bivouac area every 20 minutes was, in many ways, more psychologically damaging than a full-scale bombardment. It created a state of constant nerve-shredding tension, a certainty that at any moment death could fall from the sky. This doctrine of unceasing combat reached its terrifying apex on November 20th, 1943, at the Tarawa Atoll. The main island, Betio, was arguably the most heavily fortified position on Earth at that time. It was a mere 2 miles long and 800 yards wide, but it bristled with coastal defense guns, machine gun nests, and anti-tank ditches, all manned by nearly 5,000 elite Japanese naval infantry. Their commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, famously boasted that it would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to conquer Tarawa. The 2nd Marine Division intended to do it in 3 days. The initial landings were a catastrophe. Unexpectedly, low tides meant the landing craft got stuck on a coral reef hundreds of yards from the shore. The Marines were forced to abandon their vehicles and wade through chest-deep water, directly into the interlocking fields of fire from Shibasaki's perfectly prepared defenses. The first waves were slaughtered. The lagoon turned red, and to any conventional military observer, the assault should have failed. The losses were catastrophic, the situation untenable. Any other army might have pulled back, regrouped, and attempted a landing elsewhere. But the Marines did not pull back. They simply kept coming. Wounded men gave their ammunition to those who could still advance. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers, seeing their commanders fall, took charge and organized small groups to crawl, swim, and fight their way ashore. For the Japanese defenders, it was a bewildering and terrifying spectacle. They were inflicting casualties on a scale that should have broken any attack, yet the enemy just absorbed the losses and continued to advance, a seemingly unstoppable tide of men fueled by a ferocity they couldn't comprehend. They were witnessing the second terrible truth about the Marines. Their doctrine accepted and could sustain a level of casualties that defied all military logic. The 76 hours it took to secure the island of Bateo were a turning point in the Pacific War, not just for the territory gained, but for the psychological lesson delivered. The American public was shocked by the more than 3,000 Marine casualties suffered for a tiny speck of coral. But for the Japanese High Command, the shock was of a different nature. They had designed Tarawa to be a marine killer, a perfectly engineered meat grinder. They had succeeded in killing and wounding thousands, and yet the island had still fallen. This was the moment the core of Japan's defensive strategy began to fracture. That strategy, known as Jikusen, was a protracted war of attrition. But it was an attrition aimed at the enemy's soul, not just his body count. Japanese planners knew they could never match American industrial output. They couldn't build more ships, more planes, or more tanks. Their one perceived advantage was spiritual fortitude. They believed the Japanese soldier, willing to die without question for his emperor, could inflict such horrific, gut-wrenching casualties on the soft Americans that the public and politicians back home would lose their will to continue the fight. Every island fortress was a sacrificial altar, designed to bleed America until its people demanded an end to the war. Tarawa proved that the United States Marine Corps was willing to pay the butcher's bill in full. The battle negated Japan's entire strategic calculus. The message sent from the bloody sands of Bateo was clear. There was no price too high. This terrifying reality was reinforced with even greater brutality in the campaigns that followed. On Saipan in June of 1944, the Marines faced not just fortified positions, but also the largest banzai charge of the war, a suicidal wave of over 3,000 desperate soldiers. The Marines bent, but did not break, and annihilated the attack. On Peleliu in September of that same year, the Japanese changed tactics. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, they abandoned the beach defenses and banzai charges. Instead, they created a labyrinthine defense-in-depth system of interlocking caves, tunnels, and pillboxes in the island's coral ridges. It was a defensive masterpiece designed for maximum attrition. The battle for Peleliu was supposed to last days. It lasted over 2 months. The 1st Marine Division suffered casualty rates exceeding 60%, a level that would have rendered any other military unit combat ineffective. But the division was not destroyed. It was pulled off the line, replenished with fresh replacements, and made ready to fight again. For the Japanese defenders sealed in their caves, this was the ultimate psychological weapon. They fought with incredible bravery and skill, exacting a terrible toll for every yard of ground. But they did so with the certain knowledge that their own losses were permanent. No reinforcements were coming. Every bullet they fired, every grenade they threw, was one less they would ever have. Meanwhile, the enemy they were fighting seemed to have an infinite supply of everything: ammunition, food, medical supplies, and most terrifyingly of all, men. The Japanese soldier was prepared to die. What he was not prepared for was the crushing realization that his sacrifice, no matter how valiant, was strategically irrelevant. He was facing an enemy that could absorb losses that should have been decisive and simply continue the assault, an enemy whose logistical tail reached all the way back to a continent of endless factories. The very foundation of Bushido was being eroded by the sheer, brutal mathematics of industrial warfare. The Japanese military mind was adept at classifying its enemies. They had faced armies with immense manpower like the Russians, and armies with deep spiritual resolve but poor equipment like the Chinese. Their entire strategic framework was built around exploiting the perceived weaknesses of these archetypes. Against overwhelming numbers, they would use superior training and fighting spirit. Against a spiritually committed foe, they would leverage their own technological and organizational advantages. But the United States Marine was a terrifying anomaly, a foe who fit no existing category and broke every established rule of war. They were the impossible fusion of two concepts the Japanese had always believed to be mutually exclusive: primeval warrior spirit and advanced industrial materialism. Japanese military culture was centered on the concept of seishin, or spirit. It was an intangible but all-important force that could and should overcome any material disadvantage. A single Japanese soldier, imbued with the Yamato spirit and loyalty to the emperor, was believed to be the martial equal of a dozen lesser men. This wasn't just propaganda. It was the foundational belief system of the entire officer corps. They had seen it work in Manchuria and China. It was their ultimate weapon. The crisis that unfolded from Guadalcanal to Peleliu was the slow, horrifying realization that the enemy also possessed a powerful seishin. It was not the same as theirs. It was not born of ancient tradition or emperor worship. It was something more tribal, a ferocious, almost feral loyalty to the small unit, the squad, the platoon, the corps itself. They witnessed Marines charge machine gun nests not for an abstract ideal, but to save the men to their left and right. They saw a willingness to sacrifice that was a mirror image of their own, but sourced from a different wellspring of devotion. This discovery was profoundly unsettling. But what turned unease into outright despair was that this spirit was not being used to compensate for material weakness. Instead, it was amplified by a torrent of industrial might that beggared belief. The individual Marine, as ferocious as he was merely the tip of a very long and very sharp spear. He was the human guidance system for a deluge of high explosives, steel, and fire. The Japanese soldier in his pillbox wasn't just facing a man with a rifle. He was facing a seamlessly integrated killing system. A single machine gun nest would be targeted by mortars. A stubborn bunker would be engaged by the 75mm cannon of a Sherman tank, a monster of steel that was impervious to their standard rifles and machine guns. And then, most feared of all, came the weapons that seemed born from a nightmare: the flamethrower. It was a weapon not just of death, but of psychological terror, reaching into the dark, fortified spaces that were supposed to be safe and turning them into inescapable furnaces. Captured Japanese diaries and post-war interrogations are filled with mentions of these specific weapons. The combination of the Sherman tank and the flamethrower became a signature of the Marine advance. Japanese commanders, like General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, preparing his masterful defense of Iwo Jima, analyzed these earlier battles with grim precision. He understood that the true threat was not merely the technology. The danger was that this awesome, terrifying technology was being wielded by men who fought with the same fanatical determination as his own. It was a perfect and perfectly horrifying synthesis. It was the warrior ethos of a Spartan combined with the arsenal of a god of industry. Facing this, the Japanese soldier was no longer just fighting a battle of spirit versus material. He was fighting an enemy who had mastered both. The devastating synthesis of spirit and steel was coordinated by a command philosophy that proved just as lethal as any weapon in the Marine arsenal. The Imperial Japanese Army operated under a rigid, top-down command structure. It was a system that prized obedience and adherence to the plan above all else. A junior officer or a non-commissioned officer would rarely, if ever, deviate from his orders, even if the battlefield situation had changed dramatically. Initiative was not only discouraged, it was often seen as a form of insubordination. This rigidity was a reflection of the culture itself, a source of immense discipline and cohesion. But in the chaotic, fast-moving island battles against the Marines, it became a fatal flaw. The American approach was fundamentally different. The Marine Corps, from its inception, had cultivated a culture of decentralized command. It was built on the principle of commander's intent. A platoon leader wasn't just given an objective. He was told the overall goal his company commander was trying to achieve. If the original plan fell apart upon contact with the enemy, which it almost always did, that junior leader was not only empowered but expected to use his own judgment to find a new way to accomplish the mission's intent. This philosophy cascaded down the ranks. The corporal leading a four-man fire team was trained to think, to adapt, to take charge if his sergeant went down. This meant that a Marine unit was not a rigid spear, but a fluid organism. If the head was severed, another would take its place. If it hit an obstacle, it would flow around it, probing for weaknesses, exploiting opportunities with a speed that the Japanese command structure simply could not match. A Japanese platoon, finding its path blocked by a hidden machine gun nest, would be forced to halt, report up the chain of command, and wait for new orders. By the time those orders arrived, the tactical situation could have changed entirely. A Marine platoon in the same situation would react instantly. The platoon sergeant would direct one squad to lay down suppressive fire while another maneuvered to flank the position. The call for support would be direct and immediate, often using a portable radio to speak directly to mortar teams or even request air support. This tactical flexibility was magnified by the Marines' mastery of combined arms. They didn't just coordinate infantry, tanks, and artillery. They seamlessly integrated naval gunfire and close air support into their ground operations. A small unit pinned down by a bunker could call on the 5-inch guns of a destroyer sitting just offshore, bringing a level of precision firepower to the squad level that was simply unimaginable to their opponents. On Saipan and Okinawa, Japanese soldiers in their caves could hear the drone of Maytag Charlie, the small spotter planes that circled endlessly overhead. They knew that the moment they revealed their position, by firing a weapon, the radio call would go out, and within minutes, a torrent of shells from ships they couldn't see or planes they couldn't fight would descend upon them. This created a profound sense of helplessness. The Japanese soldier was fighting a localized, visceral battle focused on the few hundred yards of terrain in front of him. The Marine, however, was fighting on a multi-dimensional battlefield, able to summon and direct overwhelming force from the sea and the sky. The result was a constant, debilitating tactical mismatch. The Japanese were always reacting, always a step behind, trapped in a decision-making cycle that was too slow to cope with an enemy that was faster, more flexible, and lethally adaptable. This battlefield adaptability was a direct result of a training doctrine that was as brutal as it was effective. Japanese training was focused on creating the perfect individual warrior, a soldier of unparalleled physical endurance and unwavering spiritual devotion. Recruits were subjected to harsh discipline, endless drills, and an indoctrination that stripped away their individuality, reforging them as instruments of the emperor's will. Bayonet practice, long marches, and the cultivation of an aggressive fighting spirit were paramount. The goal was to produce a soldier who would charge a machine gun without a moment's hesitation. And in this, they were incredibly successful. Marine Corps training, however, had a different objective. While it was famously and punishingly difficult, its ultimate goal was not just to create a tough individual, but to build a cohesive and intelligent small unit. Boot camp at Parris Island or San Diego was a crucible designed to do two things simultaneously: break down the civilian ego and instill an absolute, unshakable faith in the Marine to one's left and right. The training emphasized teamwork, problem-solving under extreme stress, and above all, marksmanship. Every Marine, from a cook to a clerk, was first and foremost a rifleman. This fundamental difference in philosophy created a stark contrast on the battlefield. The Japanese soldier was an exceptional offensive weapon in a planned assault, a master of the bayonet charge. The Marine was a master of fire and maneuver. He was taught to see the battlefield as a geometry problem, a puzzle of interlocking fields of fire, cover, and concealment. He was trained not just to shoot, but to shoot with precision, to make every round count, a skill honed through countless hours on the rifle range. This emphasis on marksmanship meant that Marine units could generate a volume and accuracy of suppressive fire that was often shocking to their opponents. When combined with their superior semi-automatic M1 Garand rifles, a single Marine squad could put more lead downrange than a larger Japanese unit equipped with bolt-action Arisaka rifles. The tactical implications were enormous. It allowed the Marines to pin their enemies in place, robbing them of their mobility and their ability to bring their own superior close combat skills to bear. A banzai charge, the ultimate expression of Japanese fighting spirit, became a suicidal exercise when launched into the disciplined, rapid fire of a line of Marine riflemen who had been trained since day one to hit a target at 500 yards. This training extended beyond the rifle. Marines were cross-trained on different weapons within the squad. A rifleman knew how to operate the Browning automatic rifle. The bar man knew how to use the rifleman's Garand. This created a level of redundancy and resilience within the unit. If a key weapon operator was hit, someone else could immediately take his place, ensuring the squad never lost its firepower. For the Japanese soldier, peering from his bunker, the enemy advance was a terrifyingly professional spectacle. It was not a wild, chaotic rush. It was a methodical, almost scientific process of dismantling his defenses. One group of Marines would be providing covering fire, their bullets snapping inches over his head with unnerving accuracy, while another group advanced using every piece of available cover, getting ever closer. It was a relentless, calculated aggression born of a training system that valued intelligent, coordinated violence over pure, fanatical bravery. It was one more piece of the puzzle that made the Marines such a uniquely dreaded foe. Beyond the tangible factors of firepower and tactics, Japanese soldiers encountered a cultural phenomenon within the Marine Corps that was both baffling and deeply unnerving: their irreverent and seemingly unbreakable morale. The Imperial Japanese military was a world of rigid hierarchy and solemn duty. Humor, especially in the face of the enemy, was unthinkable. A soldier's demeanor was expected to be a reflection of the gravity of his mission and his devotion to the emperor. Laughter and lightheartedness were seen as signs of indiscipline and a lack of martial seriousness. The Marines, by contrast, operated in a world fueled by a dark, cynical humor that thrived in the worst possible conditions. This wasn't a sign of weakness, but a powerful psychological coping mechanism, a way of maintaining sanity in the midst of chaos. Japanese intelligence officers, poring over captured letters or interrogating the rare prisoner, were often bewildered by the tone. Marines would write home with a strange mix of bravado and gallows humor, complaining about the food, the insects, and the incompetence of their officers in one sentence, then describing a harrowing firefight with detached professionalism in the next. This attitude was a form of psychological armor. It allowed them to endure hardships and witness horrors that would break lesser men. They nicknamed the miserably hot and humid island of Peleliu, or Peleliu University, as if their ordeal was simply a tough semester at a grim institution of higher learning. The ever-present threat of death was met not with solemn fatalism, but with a shrug and a joke. This cultural disconnect created a sense of profound otherness. The Japanese soldier understood the enemy who fought with silent, grim determination. He did not understand the enemy who would risk his life to retrieve a wounded comrade and then, moments later, be laughing while sharing a can of peaches. The seemingly casual approach to war was misinterpreted as a lack of respect for the fight, but in reality, it was the very thing that made them so resilient. Their morale was not dependent on grand victories or patriotic speeches from distant generals. It was forged and maintained at the squad level, in the bonds between men who shared the same miserable patch of mud, the same tins of cold rations, and the same dark jokes. This resilience extended to their ability to absorb and process combat stress. While Japanese doctrine emphasized a glorious death in battle, it had little framework for dealing with the psychological toll on those who survived. The concept of battle fatigue, or what we now call PTSD, was often viewed as a spiritual or personal failing. For the Marines, while the understanding of combat psychology was still in its infancy, the supportive structure of the small unit provided an informal but vital outlet. The shared experience, the ability to talk, complain, and laugh about the absurdity of their situation kept them functional in environments that bred madness. A Japanese soldier, isolated in his pillbox, bore his fear and his duty in stoic silence. A Marine in a foxhole drew strength from the man next to him, from the shared litany of complaints, hopes, and jokes that served as a defiant assertion of their humanity in the face of inhuman conditions. It was a weapon the Japanese had no defense against, a form of spiritual strength they had never anticipated and could not replicate. They could kill a Marine's body, but they could not seem to break his spirit. Ultimately, the defining factor that cemented the Marine's reputation as Japan's most feared enemy was the one Japan could never hope to counter: the overwhelming, soul-crushing power of American logistics and its war of attrition. To the individual Japanese soldier, this was not an abstract, strategic concept discussed in distant headquarters. It was a daily, visceral reality that ground down his will to fight long before he ever saw an enemy Marine. He fought with a finite supply of everything. Every rice ball he ate, every round of ammunition he fired, was one that would likely never be replaced. He fought in worn boots and a tattered uniform, often weakened by malnutrition and tropical diseases for which he had little or no medicine. His connection to the homeland was severed. For the garrisons on islands like Peleliu or Iwo Jima, the battle began with the absolute certainty that there would be no reinforcements, no resupply, and no evacuation. Their war was a countdown to zero. The American Marine, by stark contrast, was the leading edge of a seemingly infinite supply chain. When he ran low on ammunition, more was brought ashore. When his rations were depleted, pallets of food, cigarettes, and even mail from home would arrive. He fought with the confidence that behind him was the full, focused might of the world's greatest industrial power, a power that could build ships faster than Japan could sink them and produce artillery shells in such quantities that they could literally afford to reshape the landscape of an island before the first infantryman set foot on it. This disparity was most terrifyingly illustrated in the care of the wounded. A Japanese soldier wounded in battle faced a grim prognosis. Medical supplies were scarce, trained surgeons were few, and evacuation was impossible. A minor shrapnel wound could easily become a fatal infection. His best hope was often a quick death, or, if he was able, a final suicidal charge. A wounded Marine, however, activated a logistical miracle. Corpsmen, often unarmed and displaying incredible bravery under fire, would stabilize him on the front line. He would then be moved to a battalion aid station, then to a fully equipped field hospital just behind the lines, and often within hours he would be aboard a hospital ship with capabilities rivaling the best hospitals in the United States. The Japanese soldier knew that his nation considered him an expendable asset. The American Marine knew with absolute certainty that his country would move heaven and earth to save him. This knowledge had a profound effect on combat motivation. It allowed Marines to take risks, to stay in the fight after being wounded, to push forward in the face of horrific casualties, secure in the knowledge that if they fell, an incredible system was in place to give them a fighting chance at survival. The war in the Pacific was not just a clash of armies, it was a clash of systems. The Japanese system, built on spiritual fervor and finite local resources, was pitted against an American system built on industrial capacity and global reach. On Iwo Jima, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi created one of the most brilliant defensive networks in military history. His men fought with a tenacity and courage that stunned their opponents. But even before the first Marine landed, Kuribayashi knew the outcome was inevitable. He was not fighting a battle. He was managing an extermination. He was facing an enemy who could not be bled dry, who could not be broken by losses, and who could not be starved into submission. He was facing an enemy that had perfected the grim mathematics of attrition. The final campaigns of the war, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, became the ultimate expression of this dreadful asymmetry. They were battles fought with no strategic surprises left. By February of 1945, the Japanese High Command knew the war was lost. The combined fleet was at the bottom of the sea, the air forces were decimated, and the American industrial engine was operating at peak capacity. The only strategy remaining was to make the inevitable victory so costly, so soaked in American blood, that the Allies might offer terms short of unconditional surrender. Iwo Jima and Okinawa were not meant to be won, they were meant to be slaughterhouses. General Kuribayashi on Iwo Jima and General Mitsuru Ushijima on Okinawa were brilliant, pragmatic commanders. They studied the failures of previous island defenses and adapted. They forbade the wasteful banzai charges. They ordered their men to abandon the beaches and construct deep, interconnected defensive systems in the volcanic rock of Iwo and the limestone ridges of Okinawa. Their new doctrine was simple and chilling. Kill as many Marines as possible. from concealed, fortified positions before dying. Every Japanese soldier was to stay in his position until the end, taking his 10-to-1 toll. Iwo Jima, in particular, was a fortress unlike any seen before, a volcanic wasteland honeycombed with 16 miles of tunnels, thousands of pillboxes, and hidden artillery positions, all perfectly sited to create lethal, overlapping fields of fire. For the Marines of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions, the island was a nightmare made real. There was no jungle for cover, only black volcanic ash that made digging foxholes nearly impossible. Every yard of advance had to be paid for in casualties. The fighting was intimate and brutal, a slow, methodical grind of flamethrowers, demolition charges, and grenades thrown into the mouths of caves. The battle devolved into thousands of separate, small unit actions, a squad-level war against a nearly invisible enemy. And yet, the Marines adapted. They became masters of this new subterranean warfare. Tank infantry teams worked in seamless coordination. One Sherman tank would fire white phosphorus shells into a cave opening to obscure the enemy's vision, while another, a flamethrower variant, would move up to engulf the position in liquid fire. For the Japanese defenders, it was an unimaginable hell. They fought in total darkness, choked by volcanic dust and the stench of death, sustained by dwindling supplies of water and rice. They could hear the Americans moving above them, drilling holes through the rock to drop explosives into their tunnels. They knew their struggle was hopeless, yet they fought on with a fatalistic courage that earned them the grudging respect of the Marines trying to kill them. The casualty figures from Iwo Jima were staggering. Nearly 7,000 Marines were killed and another 20,000 wounded. It was the only battle in the Pacific War where American casualties outnumbered the Japanese. But the grim math of attrition still held. The entire Japanese garrison of over 20,000 men was annihilated. The Marines, however, could be replaced. The divisions that were shattered on Iwo Jima would be reconstituted. The Japanese garrison would not. This was the final, terrible lesson. Even when faced with the most brilliantly conceived defense and the most fanatical resistance, the Marine Corps, backed by the logistical might of the United States, would simply absorb the cost and continue its inexorable advance. There was no strategy, no tactic, no level of sacrifice that could ultimately halt this machine. By the time the guns fell silent over Okinawa in June of 1945, the reputation of the United States Marine was no longer a matter of battlefield debate. It was a settled historical fact, written in blood and fire across the Pacific. From the first shocking encounter in the jungles of Guadalcanal to the final, hellish battles in the caves of Iwo Jima and the muddy hills of Okinawa, the Japanese military had been forced to dismantle its most fundamental beliefs about its enemy. The initial propaganda depicting soft, materialistic individualists had been violently refuted. In its place was a portrait of a warrior who was, in the minds of his Japanese adversaries, a terrifying paradox. He was a product of a democracy who fought with the tribal loyalty of a clan warrior. He was an ordinary citizen who, when put into a uniform, displayed a ferocity in close combat that rivaled their own samurai traditions. He possessed a dark, irreverent humor in the face of death that they mistook for weakness, but which was in fact a source of unbreakable psychological resilience. He was a master of combined arms, directing the fury of ships and planes with a terrifying intimacy, a battlefield conductor orchestrating a symphony of destruction. He was empowered by a doctrine of decentralized command that made his units faster, more adaptable, and more lethal than their own rigid formations. But above all, he was the living embodiment of a nation that could absorb punishment on a scale that should have broken any army, and yet continue to advance. He was the spearhead of a logistical juggernaut that could replace every man, every bullet, and every tank, turning every battle into a war of attrition that Japan was mathematically doomed to lose. The diaries of Japanese soldiers and the post-war analyses of their officers tell a consistent story. They speak of a foe who was relentless, who denied them rest, who maintained constant pressure, and who fought with a cold, professional rage. Men like General Tadamichi Kuribayashi did not underestimate the Marines. They planned for them, respected their fighting ability, and did everything in their power to inflict maximum casualties. What they could not plan for was the system that stood behind the individual Marine, a system that could train him, equip him, sustain him, heal him, and if he fell, replace him endlessly. The final verdict came from the very men who had faced them. They were, in the grim assessment of their enemies, the most formidable adversary on the battlefield. They had shattered the myth of Japanese spiritual superiority, not by being inhuman, but by combining a fearsome, all-too-human fighting spirit with an industrial power that was simply overwhelming. The legacy of the Marine in the Pacific is not just one of victory, but of the profound and terrifying psychological impact they had on an enemy who was prepared to fight to the last man, only to discover that the men arrayed against them were prepared to do the same, and had a nation behind them that would ensure they would never run out of men to do it.